Good morning and welcome to Ink Art, Past as Present in Contemporary China. I'm Mike Hearn, Chairman of the Asian Art Department and Curator of the exhibition, and it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome you all here, including a number of the artists who are featured in the exhibition, who came yesterday to have a discussion amongst themselves and with some of the scholars in the field. And so it's both a privilege and maybe a little bit added pressure to be talking about works of art by the artists who are in the audience. I'm used to talking about dead artists and having to have live artists to correct me. One of the pieces in the exhibition is a table by Ai Weiwei that you'll see stands both on the floor and on the wall. And I always think of that piece as that must be what an art historian's reconstruction of a table would look like. So before I begin our proceedings, I would like to first acknowledge two of the pillars in the field of Chinese painting studies who passed away last week. Jim Cahill died at the age of 87 on February 14th, and just 2 days later, Michael Sullivan died at the age of 97 in Oxford. And these two men were really mentors to us all. Michael Sullivan in particular focused on art of modern and contemporary China. He was a real leader in that field. He was meeting with the artists as early as the 40s and 50s and spent a lifetime introducing those artists to the West. And of course, Jim Cahill's many publications and articles about Chinese painting really created not only the textbooks for the field, but really a very broad audience. So this is an enormous loss to all of us who knew them, who studied with them, and who benefited from their leadership and scholarship. So very sad news to relay. I want to tell you a little bit about ink art before introducing our speakers for this morning. This has really been a process of discovery for me, and it's certainly not a conclusion about contemporary art in China. It's more of a beginning. When I began to collect contemporary art, it was only about 8 years ago. Before that, I really thought the responsibility for contemporary art lay in the hands of the Museum of Modern Art and in our own Department of Modern and Contemporary Painting. And it was only slowly that I realized that the Asian Art Department is not just about the past, it's about the future. And that Asian art represents an extraordinarily long and continuous tradition, and that it's important to see that tradition right down to the present, and that in fact, many of the works of art that were created by the 35 artists in this exhibition, I think, the reason I brought them together is not because they're all works of ink even. Ink art was a title that started early and it sort of held on, even though, as you'll see from my slides, the parameters of the exhibition grew quite a bit. But really what it comes down to is that I feel that Chinese art is so deeply ingrained in the consciousness and perceptions of anyone who is born in China. And all of these artists grew up in mainland China. Their 70 works, I think, exemplify how traditional Chinese art has continued to influence and have an impact on their own works, their own creations. And so the other agenda here, of course, was that I wanted the North Wing and Asian art to be more visible. And this is the view from the Great Hall. It was very frustrating to me that when people think of contemporary art, they may not even think of the Met, but if they do, they go to the south end of the building. And I felt it was important to bring people to the north end of the building as well. And so I wanted to, right from the Great Hall balcony, I wanted people to encounter works of art that I felt had valid contributions, conversations rather, with the past. So Youngjae Chong's wonderful triptychs, for example, I learned from him that he was so pleased that this work was displayed next to a 14th century mural because some of his earliest work was studying Taoist murals of the 14th century. And in the same way, Zhou Zhijie the ambition and scale of his work was also mural-like in its proportions. And so I felt these works of art really belonged in a space. In fact, it was the only space we could fit them in, to be truthful. But the other thing is to put these works into the galleries for Chinese painting and calligraphy was in a way to test whether we could accommodate contemporary art adequately. Sometimes we couldn't. Gu Wenda's large work wouldn't even fit inside the case that I had imagined it to be in. So we've done our best to shoehorn these materials into the exhibition, but also it's really a way of saying to myself and to the world, I think, that Chinese contemporary art can coexist and in fact will be meaningfully displayed in a context that references traditional China. So in creating the exhibition, I developed 4 specific themes that I wanted to, that I thought were ways of understanding this material. There were obviously a great many works of contemporary art that I didn't think belonged in our galleries or even in this context, but one of the most important contexts was the written word. Everybody who visits China now walks under the portrait of Chairman Mao when they enter the Forbidden City. But before the 20th century, as one of our speakers today has pointed out very cogently, there was no such thing as physical, either 2- or 3-dimensional portraits of political leaders. Instead, it was the written word that carried meaning, that projected and proclaimed the majesty and laws and ideologies of its rulers. So even today, the written word is a tremendously powerful part of the landscape of China. And it's from that context that we see an extraordinary body of works that were created in the beginning of the 1980s. This is Wu Xiangzhuan's piece from 1989, which also was transfigured, in fact, by the Cultural Revolution and the fact that these large character posters that were everywhere were constantly being put up, were constantly being amended as political changes occurred. And so this whole idea of effacing words, crossing them out, and ultimately not only is the calligraphic style itself one that's kind of faceless or anonymous or very much modernist in its aesthetic, but these words don't add up to a logical sentence. They're particles, they're conjunctions, they don't mean anything. So the challenging of both the written word and the meaning of the word, and whether art and calligraphy can exist without that semantic meaning, was an important part of these artists' works. Another striking feature of these works is their condition. When you go into the galleries, you'll see many of them are crinkled and wrinkled. These things still have the original pinholes the artists used in 1989 to put them up in the galleries. They were not made with gold frames. They weren't made to address the future or the ages. These things were of the moment. They were very much inspired by what was going on at the time. They were fresh and raw. And it's that rawness that I wanted to capture. I didn't want, in a work, for example, by Gu Wenda from 1985, Gu Wenda lives in Brooklyn now, and he continues to be a very prolific artist, but I wanted to reach back to when he was just beginning to challenge himself and the art world with works such as this. This is actually part of what was originally a pentad, and the central image here is of a character hovering over this dark landscape. It's an invented character. It doesn't mean anything. So what is the use of language when it no longer communicates the verbal context? Now, we can parse this word. We can take it apart, and if you look at the right 2 components, it says Chang, the left 2 is Shen. So it's something like expanding spirit. And so perhaps this whole idea of this hovering character over the landscape is really denoting a new tradition that's beginning to open up in China itself. So the written word, separate from its word's semantic meaning, becomes a very important theme, highlighted, I think, by this work by Xu Bing. Xu Bing's mother was a librarian, and he used to wander through the stacks of the Peking University. So this work is created in the image of a traditional Chinese book, stitched together, wonderful all the details, like the title, footnoting, the labels, all of that based on tradition. And in fact, Xu Bing's own training was as a wood carver, so he was able to actually hand carve some 1,200 invented characters to create this work. None of them are legible. All of these are made up, imaginary. They're built up of different components, but they cannot be read. So you can imagine the impact of a whole world created like this, where things hanging from the ceiling, hung from the walls, created an environment. So when this was first shown in China in 1989, there was almost a riot, because people tried to read these things. There must be somewhere in this an embedded message. It couldn't be found. Obviously, the message was there in front of everyone. If a word can't be read, it can't be censored. And the powerful reaction against this piece shows that Xu Bing was touching a raw nerve. He actually was forced to leave China shortly thereafter. He took a position at the University of Wisconsin. And in this country, he did something really remarkable. As a Chinese living in another world, how can he somehow re-identify himself as Chinese? How does he deal with his Chinese identity? Well, he created a whole other language based, in fact, on the way he wrote traditional Chinese in a way that was illegible. He wrote English in a way that looked Chinese. So he created an alphabet using components that you can actually, in many cases, trace back to components of traditional calligraphy. But when you actually realize what he's doing, he has created words, English words, following the same square format that's used in Chinese. So, can you read it? Rain, rain, go away. Right, I think you can read the rest. So, one of the most interesting comments made by Duan Xiong in yesterday's gathering was that it was only when he left China and went to Germany that suddenly he started to question what his identity was. He said it was like holding up a mirror to his face. And I think the same thing must have been running through Zhang Huan's mind when he created this work. He asked 3 calligraphers to help write different characters on his face. They're almost all based on traditional Chinese way of reading a person's identity, their physiognomy. So all of these comments, as they continued to write and write over his face, demonstrated that, in fact, the cultural overlay of Chinese tradition removed his personal identity. In the same way, he said, when I came to America, I was no longer an artist. I was a Chinese artist. So this whole idea of being labeled and being and also having to sort of create one's identity from underneath a traditional culture that is so long and so trenchant was obviously a challenge. So, in addition to the written word, landscape was another important theme that I wanted to explore, and I began again looking at works that were rooted in tradition, both in format, long hand scrolls, and using ink and brush. This is Liu Dan's work of 1990, a year after the repression of the democracy movement in Tiananmen Square. This is his reaction, living abroad in Hawaii at the time. He created this almost volcanic eruption on the right, and as you unroll the scroll, the landscape turns into this really frozen imagery where you have clouds, sky, water, and land all mixed up so that it's an uninhabitable space. So he's taken some of the elements of traditional landscape, the format, the ink, the brushwork, but transformed it into something completely new. And here too, I feel works by Youngjae Chong and Zhou Zhijie are also breaking new ground, both in subject matter and in scale. And in fact, Zhou Zhijie's work, for me, became a kind of mantra for how I view the role of a curator in dealing with contemporary art. And of course, it's also a challenge to the artists themselves. This was a work he began in 2007. At the time, he had a baby daughter who was mortally ill in a hospital. Happily, she has survived and is thriving. But this is 1/10 of a work of 30 hanging scrolls that he did as part of an installation about suicide. It's an image of one of the two of the piers of the Nanjing Bridge, which is a great monument to Chinese autonomy, independence built in the 1960s, but it's also the site of the greatest number of suicides in China. So with that in mind, how to make a statement about suicides and how to perhaps arrest their future growth in numbers, he created this work as part of a large installation at the Ulin Center in Beijing. But what moved me most were the writings that he inscribed on each of the 30 scrolls. He called them 30 letters to Qiu Jiahua, his daughter. For me, these three statements really summarize the role of art and artists and the challenges of the same. On the right-hand side, his inscription reads, 你要时常回到过去. You often want to go back to the past. And yet the imagery of an anchor trying to restrain the waters of the Yangtze River is a vivid metaphor, I think, for the impossibility of holding on to the past. We can look to the past, but we shouldn't dwell in it. And that's the point that he makes in the middle section where you see his daughter portrayed here above the bridge. 不要尝试离开现在. You don't want to often leave the present. So we look to the past, but we're really anchored in the present. This is where we belong. And most telling of all, the last of the triptych, 他们所说的未来，这是空中楼阁. What people call the future is nothing more than fantasies of halls and pavilions in the sky. And to illustrate that point, he uses this wonderful image of Tatlin's monument to the Third Internationale built in 1920 as a model, but never completed. So the whole idea of creating an ideal socialist state that was behind Tatlin's vision never came about. And in the same way, I don't think we as curators can actually predict the future. And it's really the artists who have to challenge themselves every day to not create the future, but to create the present. So what I found is that there's an enormous variety and richness to the ways in which artists are using the tradition of ink painting or tapping into themes like landscape. So this is Duan Jin Yu, who did a series of works on cardboard. These are throwaway pieces of packaging. And what she did is create images that were clearly inspired by almost trite imagery that would have been appropriate for any travel brochure. And in fact, in packaging a tour of China, probably everybody knows this image of Guilin. So she literally uses packaging as the medium for her work, but she also very cleverly and creatively uses the corrugations on the cardboard to evoke the sense of the rippled water. So out of this materialistic and throwaway material, she's created something of, I think, lasting beauty. So one of the striking things that I came upon when doing this exhibition was the way in which not only are artists tapping into tradition. This is Liang's image. It's very much based on a 12th century hand scroll. But when you look closely, you'll see that instead of rocks and trees, he's built up the landscape using power lines and images of buildings to create an image of cityscape that is really uninhabitable. So he's transformed the natural world into a world made by man, but made by man in such a way that it's no longer functional. It's a dystopia rather than a utopia. And the image of cities really became one of the major themes in the exhibition. Of course, using photography was, I thought, maybe that's cheating a little bit because it's probably printed with an inkjet printer, but really is it ink painting? Well, it seemed to me that it was rooted in a tradition of ink painting. And in the same sense, videography has also, I think, especially in the area of animation, you get a sense that artists are tapping into their past while doing something in a completely new medium. This is Duan Xiong, and I first was moved by his work by the way he used landscape imagery in a way that very much echoed some of the ink wash traditions of China's traditional art. But in fact, he also mined traditional texts. The Shanhai Jing Sutra of Mountains and Seas is an ancient text that he sees as kind of going back to a primitive past before Confucius, before the orthodox philosophies of China, and imagining a world that was once pristine but obviously became tainted by various strange animals and occurrences, including this mushroom that looks very familiar to us all. So how these artists used their art in ways that tap into the past, this could almost be a Yuan dynasty landscape, but in ways that are clearly referencing the modern world, was something that I felt needed to be part of the exhibition. In the same way, Lihua Xiong's imagery of the urban world, the ink city he calls this, he never studied traditional ink painting. He didn't study traditional Chinese art at all. Clearly, these images are based on modern photographs of cities, but the use of ink to tell a story and especially to create this image of the urban environment, I felt belonged in the exhibition as part of this new landscape it's such an important part of China's world now, the cityscape. At the same time, I was very inspired by Yang Fudong's elegiac imagery in works by him like Liu Lan, which contrast this young city slicker with a country girl. It really, to me, highlighted the contrast and the challenges of balancing the new world with the old. But also, I was very moved by the landscape imagery that he used throughout his films. It really echoed for me the 13th century mist-filled landscapes of the Song dynasty. Now, another area where I felt contemporary China was clearly rooted in the past, but moving in brand new directions, is abstraction. And abstraction in Chinese art has a long history. And I was very much aware of that when I first encountered the works of Qiu Shihua, who has for the last almost 20 years now been doing these canvases that are basically white, except as you look carefully, you can maybe see a sun reflecting on the water, a row of trees, again reflected in a pond, mountains. All of these images, for me, clearly referenced traditional Chinese painting, mist-filled landscapes, or in the case of Fang Zongyi from about 1360, the daring dissolution of landscape until it became just white paper, was clearly tapping into a source of Taoist imagery that very much influences Qiu Shihua as well. So is this landscape, is it abstraction? You could ask the same thing of this. It's clearly a little of both. Calligraphy is also, in some sense, based on the written word, and yet the expression of that word has all of the dynamic aspects that we associate with artists like Franz Klein, Robert Motherwell. This is Wang Dongling, but working about 2005, I dare say Franz Klein could never do this. But what's the difference? When Franz Klein set about to create some of his calligraphic structures, he very carefully created them as drafts first, and then enlarged them. Wang Dongling probably took just a couple of minutes to do this. It's completely spontaneous. It's rooted in years of calligraphic practice. So this kind of abstract graph, Westerners can respond to as action art. It's gesture, it's figure-ground relationships. All of these words that we use to analyze abstraction in the West are equally valid when it comes to a work that's rooted in a totally different tradition. The same could be said, I think, of Lihua Xiong's amazing 4 panels. It is an extraordinary tour de force. It took him a year to make. Why? When you get up closely, you can see he hand drew every one of these lines. So we might think of an Agnes Martin who uses a straight rule to create her graphic images. This is all done by hand. So the idea of doing this, and it took him a year to do it, is all about this almost Zen-like concentration that is also part of the calligraphic tradition. Until he was 50, he was doing traditional landscapes. Suddenly, he changed and started doing things like this. Zhang Yu is another artist who started as a figural painter but moved into an extraordinary kind of non-representational abstraction with works like this, which he calls divine light. So this is a huge work. It's almost 12 feet in height. It is an extraordinarily meticulously constructed imagery. All of these layers of ink were meticulously and slowly applied over and over again. And where you see white, where you see cracks, it's all the product of first placing water on the paper, allowing it to almost dry, and then adding ink so that you get this extraordinary mottled effect and also this wonderful sense of radiance. But one of the features I love most about this is that in the midst of this imagery of a kind of a cosmic explosion or maybe a planet coming together, there is right at the top of the composition the artist's seal. So even though man seems small within this kind of cosmic vision, his presence is terribly important. So the way in which the artist put himself into this vast, complex imagery, I think is a wonderful humanistic touch. Yet another kind of abstraction uses the medium of ink in a totally different way. This is Youngjae Chong, the same man who did those colorful triptychs in the Buddhist mural gallery, using ink and building up layer after layer, an extraordinary density of ink until it becomes almost metallic in its appearance. He did this first in 1989 in an exhibition in Paris when he was felt challenged to do something that would rival the works of Western abstract artists and contemporary artists in that exhibition. And for the next 10 years, through the 90s, he continued to create these images. What he said most revealing to me yesterday was, he said, I think of this not as abstraction, but as calligraphy. Because as a student, I studied those rubbings of early writings that were basically black with white characters left in relief, if you will. And so every time I applied another layer of ink, I was thinking about the discipline of writing. And he is, in fact, a very accomplished calligrapher. So the way in which he thinks of this is very different from the way Ad Reinhardt might have described what he was trying to do with black-on-black images. So here again, the artist's point of reference, where he's coming from, has everything to do with the traditional training that he enjoyed as a young man. Now, one of the challenges I felt in the exhibition was, how do I also encompass works of installation and performance in these galleries? Because in fact, even calligraphy, and this is Wang Dongling writing, is an art. It's a performative act. When you look at calligraphy, you can vicariously follow the movement of the brush. You can actually relive, re-experience the actual creation. So, in fact, not only were calligraphers often required to perform in front of an audience, but it is a graphic and unerasable image of that performance. So, performance seemed to me to be an important and integral part of what was being done today. But how do you put that into the show? Well, happily, there were several artists who created images of their performance in a very traditional manner. This is Cai Guoqiang, and Cai Guoqiang used an album, this is opened up, accordion style, to illustrate what he planned to do as extending the Great Wall of China by 10,000 meters, or sending a message to extraterrestrials, as he said. So he actually creates most of the image of the Great Wall as this wonderful calligraphic line that he then documents. Here's Beijing, he gives all the different type sites around, and at the end he uses gunpowder to suggest using the contours of the landscape and lighting a fuse that would burn across that landscape, like bringing to life the qi, the energy in the dragon veins of the actual landscape. And when he finally did this in 1993, this is a time exposure to show you what the extent of this extraordinary performance was. But the fact that he turned to this traditional medium, traditional format to document what he was about to do, for me was a highly significant idea, even as this of transforming the landscape itself into a work of art was also referencing this whole tradition of the dragon veins that the Chinese painters try to tap into when they paint a landscape painting. Well, finally, I had to include the work of art that started me down this road. In 2006, we were able to acquire this stainless steel rock by John Wong. And for me, this was a terribly important touchstone, really, of how contemporary artists are really responding to tradition in a way that I could relate to and understand. We had recently acquired a group of traditional scholars' rocks. These are emblems of taking that same energy that Cai Guoqiang was tapping into and creating it, putting it on a desk-sized piece of rock that probably was worked by man but was carefully disguised, so it looked only as if it was eroded by nature, so a natural sculpture. In the same way, Jiang Wang's work was he took a real stone, he created a model, he cast it in iron, and then he added sheets of stainless steel around it, soldered them together, and then polished it in such a way that you can't see any of the seams. It looks like it just fell out of the sky. So it's this extraordinary work that emulates the past, but is worked in a new medium. And that whole idea of creating a garden that would be suitable for an environment of stainless steel and glass was where he started from. And in the same way, Zhang Jianjun's large purple rock was, for me, another way in which we could create a conversation between old and new. That in a traditional garden, there is an opportunity to place a particularly fine specimen rock. And that's exactly how this half pavilion functions in the Suzhou garden, the Master of the Nets garden, that we modeled our garden on. And so I thought, why not challenge the past with this wonderful example of the present? I had no idea when we started down this road that this weighed 700 pounds and was going to be an extraordinary effort to move into this space. But that's a wonderful tribute to the Met, the fact that regardless of how difficult it was to get it into this position, and if you were watching some of the slides earlier, you may have seen some of the images of how we installed this rock. It was this ability, in the end, to follow the curatorial vision that made it possible to put this rock there. And in the end, that's really the dialogue that I wanted to create. I really wanted this exhibition to be not just about defining what was ink art, because I failed miserably at that. I decided that the title was too good to let go of, but in fact my selection in the end was really governed by those works of art that really touched me, and touched me because of their resonance with the past. And I feel that if this show accomplishes anything, it's really to say that whether we're looking at the written language, landscape, calligraphic abstractions, and even beyond the brush into 3 dimensions, that in order to appreciate the works of this group of artists, it's important to understand the artistic roots out of which they've grown. It's important to understand traditional Chinese art in order to fully understand where these artists are coming from. There's no question that these artists are also looking at contemporary art in the West, that they are tapping into that as a source of inspiration as well. But I feel many of them would be very challenged to be put in a gallery, a white box gallery, alongside our Western art. But they seem to be quite comfortable in conversation with each other and with the works from the past in our gallery. So it's really that goal that was guiding me in this exhibition. I hope you'll spend time in the galleries to see whether that exploration is really worth continuing. Thank you. So we have 3 talks this morning. Then we'll have a lunch break, and we'll come back at 2 o'clock this afternoon for another 3 talks. We have extraordinarily significant speakers who are going to be joining us throughout the day to talk about their perspectives on Chinese contemporary art. I thought I would introduce the 3 morning speakers all at once now, and then after lunch I will introduce our afternoon speakers. So our first speaker this morning is going to be Britta Erikson. Britta earned her PhD in Chinese art at Stanford University and has long been a very well-respected curator and independent scholar working in the field of contemporary art, particularly since the 1980s. She has curated and written extensively about this, and in particular about the area of ink art. She's taught courses both at Stanford and in Berkeley. Pardon me, I've got the order wrong, and thank you, Judith, for reminding me. I will finish talking about Britta, but then you will get to see Britta after Judy, Andrews, and Wu Hong. Thank you, Judith. So, computers, that's what they do for you. So I wanted to say that Britta has curated an exhibition, the first one-man exhibition held at the Sackler Museum in Washington, DC devoted to Xubing, the wonderful exhibition that was also showed his wonderful book From the Sky, which is on view again upstairs. She also was one of the important curators of an exhibition in China in the city of Chengdu in 2007, the Chengdu Biennale, which again focused on ink art. She's on the advisory board of Hong Kong's Ink Society and is currently producing a book and a series of short films about ink painting, which is entitled The Enduring Passion for Ink. So, pardon me for getting the order out of sync. Our first speaker is going to be Julia Andrews. Julia is professor and distinguished university scholar at the Ohio State University, where she's taught since 1987. She's one of the leading specialists in the art of modern China, and she's actually the person who conceived one of the first American exhibitions of contemporary Chinese art. It's called Fragmented Memory, the Chinese Avant-Garde in Exile. It was held at Ohio State's Wexner Center for the Arts in 1993. She was also responsible for conceiving and executing the Guggenheim Museum's groundbreaking 1998 exhibition, A Century in Crisis, Modernity and Tradition in the Art of 20th Century China, which was shown both here in New York and also in Bilbao. Her 2012 book, Art of Modern China, co-authored with Sheng Kui-yi, is a basic textbook for the study of Chinese modern art. Wu Hong is the Harry A. Vanderstappen Distinguished Service Professor of Art History, East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He also serves there as director of the Center of the Art of East Asia and as consulting curator of the university's Smart Museum of Art. After completing his PhD at Harvard in early Chinese art, Professor Wu has managed to balance an extraordinarily productive career studying and publishing seminal works on ancient Chinese culture with an equally extensive record of cutting-edge exhibitions and publications treating contemporary Chinese art, including the editing of Contemporary Chinese Art Primary Documents for MoMA in 2010, and also his important contribution to the catalog of the current exhibition. So Julia Andrews, Wu Hong, and Britta Erikson will be speaking to you in that order. Thank you.